December 1940, Hadamar, Germany. A gray postal bus with painted-over windows turns off the main road and climbs toward the old psychiatric facility on the hill. Inside, 23 men and women sit in silence. They were told they're being transferred to a better institution, promised improved care, modern treatments. Some of them believed it, others didn't have the capacity to understand. The bus passes through the gates. Local residents in the town below have been watching these buses arrive for months now. 3, sometimes 4 per week. Always gray. Always with covered windows. And they've noticed something else. The buses arrive full, but they always leave empty. Nobody ever comes back down that hill. Inside the facility, a doctor named Adolf Wallmann waits in his office. He's a psychiatrist, trained at respected universities, took an oath to do no harm. In the next 6 hours, he will sign 23 death certificates. Every single cause of death will be a lie. Every date will be falsified. And every one of those patients arriving on the bus will be dead by nightfall, gassed in a chamber disguised as a shower room, then burned in an oven specifically installed for that purpose. This isn't a rogue doctor. This isn't a breakdown in medical ethics at one facility. This is program. Organized, bureaucratic, with a budget, personnel files, and a headquarters at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin. That address gives the operation its code name, T4. Between 1939 and 1945, this program will kill somewhere between 200, 00 and 300 Zero-Zoran people. Not soldiers, not combatants, patients, German citizens removed from hospitals and asylums, transported in those gray buses, and systematically murdered in 6 purpose-built killing centers scattered across Germany and Austria. Now, before you assume you know this story, let me tell you what makes T4 different from every other Nazi atrocity you've heard about. This program targets the Reich's own population. These aren't Jews, or Slavs, or prisoners of war. The first victims are ethnic Germans, people whose only crime is being disabled or mentally ill or simply too old to work. And the killing doesn't happen in occupied territory or hidden camps on the Eastern Front. It happens in Germany proper, in recognizable institutions, in towns where people can see the smoke from the crematorium and smell what's burning. Today, I'm walking you through exactly how this program worked, the paperwork trail that selected victims, how medical professionals participated in mass murder while maintaining the fiction of patient care, why families received death certificates claiming their relatives died of appendicitis weeks after the appendix had already been surgically removed, and what finally forced the Nazi regime to officially shut the program down, even though the killing continued in secret until Germany's surrender, because T4 isn't just a footnote in Holocaust history, it's the proof of concept. The place where the Nazis learned how to kill large numbers of people efficiently, dispose of bodies, and maintain bureaucratic cover while doing it. The gas chambers at Hadamar are operational 2 full years before Auschwitz uses the same method. The personnel who run T4 facilities will later staff the extermination camps in Poland. This is where industrial murder gets perfected. And what makes it historically crucial is the paper trail. The Nazis document everything: assessment forms ranking patients on their economic productivity, memos discussing the cost savings of eliminating, quote, useless eaters from state institutions, transport schedules for the gray buses, even letters between doctors debating whether to use carbon monoxide or other methods for the killing. If you want to understand how a modern state turns mass murder into policy, complete with signatures, file numbers, and interdepartmental correspondence, you're looking at it. Before we push deeper into this, hit subscribe. If you're interested in World War II history that goes beyond the battles into the mechanisms of how atrocity becomes routine, and drop a comment with your answer to this. If your doctor told you that a family member died of pneumonia, but you knew they'd been healthy last week, would you have demanded to see the body? Would you have asked questions? Because that's the choice thousands of German families faced. And their answers determined whether this program stayed secret. Let's get into it. Now, we need to go back to where this begins, because T4 doesn't emerge from nowhere. It has a logic, twisted and monstrous, but internally consistent. And understanding that logic is necessary for understanding how doctors, nurses, and administrators convinced themselves they were doing something defensible. The foundation gets laid in the 1930s. The Nazi regime is obsessed with racial purity and biological fitness. They pass laws allowing forced sterilization of people with hereditary illnesses, mental disabilities, chronic alcoholism. Over 400 Zero-Zoran people are sterilized under these laws before the war even starts. But sterilization only prevents future births. It doesn't eliminate people the regime considers burdens on the state. Then, in 1939, something shifts. A father writes to Hitler's chancellery requesting permission for doctors to end the life of his severely disabled infant son. The child is blind, missing limbs, and according to the father's letter, has no prospect of improvement. Hitler sends his personal physician, Karl Brandt, to assess the situation. Brandt confirms the child's condition. Hitler authorizes the killing. That single case becomes precedent. Within months, the regime establishes a program targeting disabled children. Doctors are required to report newborns and children up to age 3 with serious disabilities. A panel of physicians reviews these reports and marks them with a plus sign for death or a minus for temporary reprieve. The children marked with a plus are sent to special pediatric units at hospitals across Germany. There, they're killed by lethal injection or deliberate overdoses of sedatives. The causes of death on official documents: pneumonia, heart failure, complications from epilepsy. Over 5, 0 Zarin children die in this program before it expands. And here's where bureaucracy and murder merge completely. The operation moves from targeting children to adults. The Reich Committee for the Scientific Registration of Serious Hereditary Ailments begins coordinating with the Interior Ministry. They need someone to run a larger program. They choose Philipp Bauer, head of Hitler's Chancellery, and Karl Brandt, the same physician who'd evaluated that first child. Bauer and Brandt set up headquarters at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, a confiscated villa in the government district. They recruit personnel, doctors, administrators, former police officers, and they begin identifying facilities that can be converted into killing centers. 6 locations get selected: Grafeneck, a remote castle in southwestern Germany; Brandenburg near Berlin; Bernburg and Sonnenstein in Saxony; Hardheim near Linz in Austria; and Hadamar in Hessen. All of them are former hospitals or asylums. All of them are isolated enough to maintain secrecy. And starting in late 1939, construction teams arrive at each site to install the necessary equipment. Gas chambers built to look like shower rooms, crematorium ovens, waiting areas, administrative offices where the false paperwork will be processed. But before the killing can begin, they need a system for selecting victims. And that selection system is where the program's true nature reveals itself, because this isn't random, it's methodical. The T4 headquarters develops a questionnaire, a single sheet of paper that gets distributed to every psychiatric hospital, asylum, and care facility in Germany. The form asks for patient information: name, diagnosis, length of stay, capacity for work. Can the patient perform labor? Do they receive regular visitors? How long have they been institutionalized? That last question matters more than it appears. Patients institutionalized for more than 5 years get flagged automatically. The assumption being that if you've been in an asylum that long, you're unlikely to ever leave. You're a permanent expense to the state. The forms get sent to Berlin in batches, thousands of them. At Tiergartenstrasse 4, 3 physicians review each questionnaire. They're making life and death decisions, but they never examine the patients. They never visit the institutions. They just read the forms and mark them. Plus, sign means death. Minus means the patient lives, at least for now. These 3 doctors process an average of 300 forms per day. That gives them roughly 90 seconds per human life. 90 seconds to read a form, make a judgment, mark it, and move to the next one. One of these assessors is named Werner Heide, a psychiatry professor. Another is Hermann Pfannmüller, who runs a children's asylum and will later become notorious for his starvation experiments. The third rotates, but the process stays the same. Once a patient's form gets marked with a plus, their name goes on a transport list. And this is where those gray buses come in. The buses are operated by a front organization called the Charitable Foundation for Curative and Institutional Care. Sounds harmless, sounds like a medical transport service. The buses even have Red Cross symbols painted on them initially, until someone realizes that violates international law and the symbols get painted over. The buses follow routes, picking up patients from multiple institutions in a single trip. Patients are told they're being moved to different facilities, better conditions, more modern treatment. Some institutions inform the families, others don't. And when families are notified, they're given almost no time to object. Your relative is being transferred tomorrow, the letter might say. No visitors allowed during the transition period. Here's what makes the deception sustainable. The families want to believe it. Germany in 1940 is at war. Resources are scarce. If the state says they're consolidating patients into more efficient facilities, that seems plausible. And for families who've struggled with the stigma of having a mentally ill or disabled relative, some feel guilty relief. The burden is being lifted. The buses arrive at the killing centers usually in the afternoon. Patients are unloaded and taken to a reception area. They're registered, photographed, and examined by a doctor. That examination is purely for documentation. The doctor notes any gold teeth, because those will be extracted after death and melted down. The Reich wastes nothing. Then comes the killing itself. At Hadamar, at Grafeneck, at all 6 centers, the process is nearly identical. Patients are led to a room they're told is a shower facility. The room has benches, fake shower heads mounted in the ceiling, and a door that locks from the outside. Once the room is full, 20 or 30 people at a time, the door seals. An operator in an adjacent room opens valves releasing carbon monoxide into the chamber. Death takes between 10 and 15 minutes. Through a small observation window, staff watch until movement stops. Then they wait an additional 20 minutes to ensure everyone is dead before opening the chamber and removing the bodies. The bodies go to the crematorium. But before cremation, a dentist extracts gold fillings. A doctor removes the brain if the patient had any neurological condition that might be of research interest. Hundreds of brains end up preserved in jars, stored at universities for future study. The ashes from multiple bodies get mixed together and placed in urns. Families receive an urn, a death certificate, and a letter of condolence. The death certificate lists a cause of death: heart failure, stroke, pneumonia, sepsis. The date of death is usually falsified, listed as occurring days or weeks after the actual killing. This is to create distance between the transport and the death, to make it seem like the patient lived at the new facility for a while before succumbing to illness. But the system has flaws. Families start noticing inconsistencies. A man who had his appendix removed years ago dies of appendicitis. A woman receives a death certificate claiming pneumonia, but the family knows she had her lungs checked recently and they were fine. Two families in the same town receive notifications on the same day, both relatives supposedly dying of the same rare condition. And then there's the urns. Some families insist on opening them. They find ashes mixed with bone fragments that clearly come from more than one person. Sometimes they find pieces of surgical screws or plates that their relative never had implanted. The word starts spreading. Quietly at first, whispered concerns between families, then louder. Priests begin hearing confessions from nurses and staff working at the institutions. Some refuse absolution, telling the staff they're participating in murder. In August 1941, a bishop named Clemens von Galen delivers a sermon in Münster. He doesn't use the word T4, he doesn't name names, but he describes what's happening: patients being transported, killed, and cremated. He calls it murder. He says that if the state can kill the disabled today, it can kill wounded soldiers tomorrow, or the elderly, or anyone deemed unproductive. The sermon gets printed and distributed across Germany. Copies circulate in churches, passed hand to hand. The Nazi regime is furious, but Galen is a prominent Catholic bishop. Arresting him would create a larger scandal, especially when Germany needs unity for the war effort. Public pressure builds. Families of victims start demanding investigations. Some threaten legal action. The bureaucratic secrecy that protected T4 is cracking. On August 24, 1941, Hitler orders the program officially stopped. Not because he's developed moral qualms, because the political cost is becoming too high. A written order goes to Bowler and Brandt. Cease the organized transports and gassing operations at the 6 centers. By that point, the program has killed over 70 Urns adults. Combined with a children's euthanasia program, the total exceeds 75 the people. But here's what most people don't realize. The official shutdown doesn't end the killing. The official shutdown of T4 in August 1941 is a bureaucratic fiction. What actually happens is the program decentralizes. The 6 major killing centers close or reduce operations, yes. The gray buses stop running regular routes. The centralized selection process at Tiergartenstrasse 4 winds down. But the killing? That accelerates. It just moves back to the institutions themselves. Historians call this phase wild euthanasia. And it's more insidious than what came before because there's no longer even a pretense of bureaucratic oversight. Individual doctors at hospitals and asylums are given authority to decide which patients live and which die. The methods change too. Gas chambers are too visible, too difficult to conceal, so the killing shifts to starvation and lethal medication. At institutions across Germany, staff implement what they call special diet protocols. Patients marked for death receive drastically reduced food rations, sometimes as little as 500 calories per day. They waste away over weeks or months. When they finally die, the official cause is listed as malnutrition or natural decline. Technically true, just not natural. Other doctors prefer medication, overdoses of sedatives, morphine, or luminol. A patient who's agitated or difficult gets an injection. They slip into unconsciousness and never wake up. The death certificate says respiratory failure or heart attack. Also technically true. The drugs did cause respiratory failure. The form just doesn't mention it was intentional. This decentralized phase is harder to track, harder to quantify. Estimates suggest another 120, 00 to 150, 0 people die between late 1941 and 1945 in these continued killings. No official transport lists, no centralized records, just individual decisions made by doctors at individual facilities scattered across the Reich. And here's where T4's true significance emerges. Because while wild euthanasia continues quietly in German institutions, something else is happening. The personnel who ran the T4 killing centers are being reassigned. The expertise they developed, the experience with gas chambers and crematoriums and mass death processing, doesn't go to waste. In late 1941 and early 1942, the Nazi regime begins construction on extermination camps in occupied Poland. Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. These aren't concentration camps like Dachau or labor camps like Auschwitz initially was. These are pure killing facilities, designed for one purpose: to murder Jews, Roma, and other targeted populations as quickly as possible. And who do they tap to run these operations? T4 veterans. Christian Wirth, who supervised the gas chamber at Grafeneck, becomes inspector of the Operation Reinhard death camps. Franz Stangl, who worked at the Hartheim Killing Center, becomes commandant of Sobibor, then Treblinka. Dozens of T4 doctors, nurses, and administrators transfer east. They bring their methods with them. The fake shower rooms at Grafeneck and Hadamar become the model for gas chambers at Treblinka. The efficiency protocols developed for processing disabled patients get scaled up to process thousands of Jewish deportees per day. Even the language carries over. In T4 facilities, the killings were called a special treatment. In the death camps, it's Sonderbehandlung, or the exact same phrase. This isn't coincidental. T4 was the pilot program, the place where the Reich learned that mass murder could be industrialized, that doctors would participate, that bureaucracy could absorb atrocity and render it routine. The Holocaust doesn't happen without T4 establishing that these methods work. Now let's talk about the perpetrators, because this is where things get morally complicated in ways that never fully resolve. These aren't SS thugs or fanatical ideologues, at least not most of them. They're credentialed physicians. Dr. Adolf Wallmann at Hadamar has a medical degree from a respected university. Dr. Horst Schumann, medical director at Grafeneck, is a published researcher. These are men who took the Hippocratic Oath. How do they justify it? We know because some of them explain later. During the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1947, several T4 physicians testified. Their justifications follow predictable patterns. First, they claim they were following orders. The program had official authorization from Hitler himself, transmitted through Bauer and Brandt. Disobeying would have meant severe consequences, possibly death. Second, they argue medical necessity. Germany was at war. Resources were scarce. Keeping thousands of severely disabled patients alive in institutions drained resources that could support the war effort or help healthy Germans. It was, they claim, a tragic calculation forced by circumstances. Third, and this is where it gets particularly disturbing, some genuinely believed they were performing mercy killings. They'd convinced themselves that patients with severe disabilities or chronic mental illness had lives not worth living, that killing them was compassionate, ending suffering that had no prospect of improvement. Let me show you how that justification collapses under scrutiny. At Hadamar, Dr. Wallmann signed death certificates for patients he never examined. He marked people for death based on paperwork, not medical assessment. At Grafeneck, Dr. Schumann gassed patients who were physically healthy but had minor intellectual disabilities. Some victims were epileptic children who could have lived productive lives with medication. This wasn't medical judgment. It was economic calculation dressed in medical language. The regime had decided certain lives were too expensive to maintain, and doctors provided professional cover for that decision. They turned murder into treatment, execution into therapy. And here's the bureaucratic detail that reveals how normalized this became. At several institutions, staff celebrated milestones. When Hadamar reached 10 Azoldurlern killings, the staff held a party. They decorated the crematorium with flowers. Someone brought beer. A photographer took pictures that survived the war. The staff posed for a group photo, smiling, marking what they called a productive achievement. Think about that. Medical professionals celebrating the killing of their 10 Auerzollernrath patient. Not with horror or shame, but with beer and flowers. That's what happens when atrocity becomes routine, when bureaucracy insulates individuals from the moral weight of what they're collectively doing. Now, the program generates resistance, though it's limited and comes late. Some families refuse to accept the death certificates. They demand investigations, threaten lawsuits. A few lawyers try to bring charges. They're quietly blocked by officials protecting the program. Some staff refuse to participate. Nurses request transfers. A handful of doctors resign rather than implement the selection protocols. Most face no punishment for refusing. The regime finds that people willing to participate are sufficient. They don't need everyone, just enough. And here's a detail that shows how permeable the secrecy really was. Townspeople near Hadamar and Grafeneck know what's happening. They see the buses arrive. They smell the crematorium smoke. Children in Hadamar create a playground rhyme. Here comes the murder box. They point at the gray buses. Local officials file complaints about the smoke, not on moral grounds, but because residents are disturbed by the smell. The response from T4 administration is to install better ventilation and to cremate at night when fewer people are watching. That's the Reich's response to mass murder becoming public knowledge. Not to stop it, but to make it less visible. When the war ends in May 1945, Allied forces discover the T4 files. Not complete records, because the administrators tried to destroy evidence in the final weeks. But enough survives. Transport lists with thousands of names, memos discussing cost savings from eliminating patients, letters between doctors debating the most efficient killing methods, photographs from that celebration at Hadamar, staff smiling next to the crematorium. American investigators entering Hadamar find the gas chamber still intact, the fake shower heads mounted in the ceiling, the observation window where staff watched patients die, the crematorium with bone fragments still visible in the oven, and in the administrative offices, filing cabinets full of death certificates, each one a carefully constructed lie. One investigator later describes opening a drawer and finding hundreds of forms, all filled out in the same handwriting, same doctor's signature, different names, different dates, different causes of death, but the handwriting identical, revealing what it was, assembly line paperwork for assembly line murder. The documentation is so extensive that prosecutors at Nuremberg create a separate trial specifically for medical personnel. The doctor's trial runs from December 1946 to August 1947. 23 defendants, most of them physicians who participated in T4 or subsequent medical experiments. 7 receive death sentences. 9 get prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. 7 are acquitted. Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and co-director of T4, is convicted and hanged at Landsberg prison in June 1948. During his trial, he maintains that the program was justified medical policy. He shows no remorse. His final statement before execution is that he acted according to his medical conscience and the laws of wartime necessity. Right up to the gallows, he insists he was a healer making difficult triage decisions during wartime. But here's what undermines his defense completely. The prosecutors present evidence that Brandt personally authorized the killing of children who could have lived normal lives with basic medical care. Epileptic children whose seizures were controlled with medication. Children with minor physical disabilities who were intellectually normal. The selection criteria weren't medical. They were economic and ideological. Other T4 personnel faced trials in German courts over subsequent decades. Dr. Adolf Wallmann, the Hadamar physician who signed thousands of false death certificates, is tried in 1947. He's convicted, but receives only 5 years in prison because the court accepts his argument that he was following orders. He serves 3 years and is released. Lives quietly in Frankfurt, even treating patients again in the 1950s, until his death in 1982. No one asks him about Hadamar. No one wants to know. Dr. Horst Schumann, who ran the gas chamber at Grafeneck and later conducted sterilization experiments at Auschwitz, escapes to Ghana after the war. He works as a physician there under a false name for years before being extradited to Germany in 1966. He's charged with thousands of murders, but claims poor health and is released from custody in 1972, dies in 1983 without serving significant time. His medical license is never revoked. The pattern repeats across dozens of cases. Doctors who killed patients by the thousands receive minimal sentences or avoid prosecution entirely. Some return to medical practice after their release. Others work in pharmaceutical companies or research institutions. The German medical establishment shows little interest in confronting what its members did during the war. It's easier to move forward, to rebuild, to forget. Meanwhile, the administrative personnel who enabled the program mostly escape prosecution altogether. The clerks who processed transport lists, the accountants who managed the budgets, the drivers who operated those gray buses. They argue they were just doing administrative work, following schedules. Most faced no charges. Even the nurses and orderlies who directly participated in killings often avoid serious consequences. At post-war trials, they successfully argue they were following doctors' orders. Medical hierarchy protects them. If a physician ordered a lethal injection, how could a nurse refuse? Courts accept this logic more often than not. As for the victims, their stories stay buried for decades. Families feel shame. Having a relative killed in T4 carries stigma because it means admitting your family had a disabled or mentally ill member. In post-war Germany, people don't talk about it. The victims remain nameless, reduced to numbers in prosecutors' files. Some families never learn the truth. They receive the false death certificates and believe them. A woman thinks her brother died of pneumonia in 1941. A man believes his sister succumbed to heart failure. The lies persist because questioning them means confronting something too painful to acknowledge. Other families know but stay silent. A mother receives an urn containing ashes that clearly come from multiple bodies. She knows her son was murdered, but she doesn't speak about it, not to neighbors, not even to her other children. The shame is too deep, the trauma too raw. It's not until the 1980s that serious historical investigation begins. Researchers start interviewing surviving family members, examining institutional records, documenting the scope of the program. What they discover is staggering. The program killed not just at the 6 major centers, but at dozens of institutions across Germany and Austria. The death toll, when you include the decentralized killing phase, reaches between 200 Einzelzaren and 300 Blitzauer people. Memorial sites get established at Hadamar and Grafeneck in the 1990s, plaques with victims' names, when they can be recovered, educational exhibits explaining what happened, School groups visit. They walk through the same rooms where patients were processed, see the crematorium ovens, read the letters from families who never saw their relatives again. But here's what those memorials can't fully capture: the casual bureaucracy of it all. The fact that a physician could spend his morning gassing patients, break for lunch in the staff cafeteria, then return to sign false death certificates. The way nurses could administer lethal injections, then go home and cook dinner for their own children. The administrative staff who processed paperwork, knowing every form represented a human being marked for death. One surviving staff member, interviewed in the 1980s, describes her work at Hadamar. She was a secretary. She typed the death certificates, filed the transport records, answered correspondence from families. She remembers it as normal office work, just typing, filing, answering phones. The fact that her typing was documenting murder didn't register at the time. It was just her job. She clocked in, did her work, clocked out. That disconnect, that ability to compartmentalize participation in mass murder as routine administrative duty, is what makes T4 so historically significant. It demonstrates something deeply unsettling about human psychology. Given official authorization, bureaucratic structure, and enough emotional distance, people can participate in atrocity without viewing themselves as perpetrators. This is what T4 demonstrates that's almost harder to process than the raw body count. It shows how ordinary people, given official authorization and bureaucratic distance, can participate in systematic murder without viewing themselves as murderers. They saw themselves as professionals doing difficult but necessary work, following protocols, contributing to the national effort. And the protocols insulated them from direct moral responsibility. The doctors in Berlin who marked the forms never met the patients. They just saw paperwork, diagnoses, statistics. The bus drivers who transported victims were just following routes on a schedule. The operators who released the gas were executing orders from medical personnel. The administrators who sent condolence letters were processing forms. Everyone had a role small enough to rationalize. That rationalization is T4's most disturbing legacy, because it establishes a template. It proves that mass murder doesn't require sadists or fanatics. It requires bureaucracy, professional credentials, and enough administrative layers that individual participants can tell themselves they're just doing their jobs. The Holocaust uses the same template on a vastly larger scale, but T4 is where it gets tested, refined, proven workable. The first industrial killing program in modern history, complete with intake procedures, efficiency metrics, and quality control measures for disposing of bodies. And it reveals something about medicine specifically. The profession dedicated to healing can be perverted into a tool for killing more easily than we'd like to admit. Because medicine already deals with life and death decisions, doctors already have authority to determine treatment. The infrastructure for patient care can be repurposed for patient elimination with relatively minor modifications. That's why medical ethics codes, created after Nuremberg, emphasize informed consent, patient autonomy, and limits on state authority over medical decisions. They're direct responses to T4, attempts to prevent doctors from ever again becoming executioners in white coats. Now, let's bring this back to where we started. That gray bus arriving at Hadamar in December 1940. 23 people inside, most of them unaware they have hours to live. Dr. Wallman waiting in his office with blank death certificates ready to fill out. The gas chamber disguised as a shower room. The crematorium oven already heated and ready. This scene repeats hundreds of times. Different patients, same process, and each time the staff go through the motions with practiced efficiency. Unload the bus, process the paperwork, lead patients to the chamber, release the gas, remove the bodies, extract the gold teeth, cremate the remains, send the urn and the condolence letter. Routine. That's the word that keeps appearing in survivor testimonies from staff. It became routine, just part of the daily schedule at the facility. So here's the uncomfortable question this program forces us to confront. How many of us, placed in that system with official authorization and professional pressure, would have gone along? How many would have convinced ourselves we were following necessary protocols in difficult circumstances? How many would have signed those forms, driven those buses, operated those valves? It's easy to say we would have refused. We'd like to believe we would have been the doctors who resigned, the nurses who requested transfers, the administrators who refused to process the paperwork. But the historical record shows that refusers were rare. Most people, given official sanction and bureaucratic cover, participated, and they lived with it afterward. Most showed no signs of severe psychological trauma. They reintegrated into post-war society, returned to medical practice, raised families. The participation in mass murder didn't break them the way we might expect. For many, it remained simply something they'd done during the war, a duty performed under extraordinary circumstances. That's maybe the most chilling detail of all. Not the body count, as horrific as it is, but the ease with which ordinary professionals absorbed industrial murder into their daily routines and then moved on with their lives when it ended. If you made it this far, you're now looking at one of the darkest chapters in medical history. A program that killed hundreds of thousands of people using the language and tools of medicine. A program that trained the personnel and developed the methods for the Holocaust. And a program that revealed how thin the line is between healing and harm when the state decides certain lives are expendable. Hit that subscribe button if this kind of historical deep dive interests you, because there are more stories like this that need to be told. Stories that make us uncomfortable, that challenge easy narratives about good and evil, that force us to recognize how normal people participate in extraordinary horror. And drop a comment with your answer to this. If you discovered your doctor had participated in something like T4, would you want them prosecuted decades later? Or would you accept that they were products of their time following orders? Because that question defined how Germany confronted its medical establishment's collaboration in mass murder. The answer matters. Because T4 didn't end with Germany's surrender. The questions it raises about medical ethics, state power, and individual responsibility remain unresolved. How much authority should the state have over who lives and dies? When does medical judgment become murder? Where's the line between following orders and moral culpability? Those buses stopped rolling up the hill to Hadamar in 1945, but the gray area between treatment and killing, between healing and harm, between medical decision and murder, that never fully disappears. It just waits for the next crisis, the next emergency, the next moment when professionals are asked to make impossible choices about who deserves care and who doesn't. And that's the creepiest thing about the creepiest secret killing program of World War II. It wasn't secret at all. Thousands of people knew. They just chose not to see it, or to rationalize it, or to accept that some lives matter less than others. That choice is always available. The buses are always ready. The paperwork is always waiting to be signed. The only question is whether we recognize the moment before it's too late, or whether we, like those doctors and nurses and administrators, convince ourselves we're just following necessary protocols during difficult times. Just doing our jobs, just following the forms. If this deep dive into one of WW2's darkest secrets made you think, hit that subscribe button. This is the kind of history that doesn't make it into textbooks, and there's more coming. Drop a like if you made it this far. It tells YouTube this matters. Now here's what I actually want to know, and be honest in the comments. If you were a German doctor in 1940 and the state handed you those patient forms with official authorization to mark people for death, do you really think you'd have refused? Not who you want to be, who you'd actually be? Because history shows most people participated. Would you be the exception or the rule? Comment below. I'll see you in the next one.